everyone. We are back and continuing our discussion about the Middle East. This time we direct our attention to the second reading, Weighing U.S. Priorities in the Middle East. As for how we're going to focus our discussion for this reading, there are two main topics that we will discuss. The first theme is the Arab-Israeli conflict, which we will discuss today. The second one, which will be discussed in a second video, is regional security. In the last video, I asked you to consider where the United States might be at with its relationship with Israel. This reading has us diving into what that relationship looks like, and additionally, what the Israeli relationship is with Palestine to present day. Until this point in the readings, we've seen the United States develop its relationship with Israel. It sees Israel as an important ally in the Middle East for a few different reasons, one of which is it is a model for democracy that the United States hopes can spread to other countries in the Middle East, which would help them solidify economic relationships. On top of that, the United States has a very strong military relationship with Israel. We also saw that the United States and its attachment to Israel has grown. It has also been challenged at times, but ultimately, to this day, the United States has a very strong relationship with Israel, and this has continued to cause problems with other Middle Eastern nations. So in the U.S. goal for regional stability, its relationship with Israel as it stands is a problem. The heart of the Arab-Israeli conflict is Palestine and Israel. And for these two lands, there are a number of unresolved issues. The reading talks about a couple of them. We'll start off with Palestinian statehood, because what is Palestine? Is it a country? Is it not a country? It really depends on who is being asked as to whether or not it is a state. If you were to ask Israel, it is certainly not a state. If you were to ask Palestine, it is a state. If you were to ask other Arab Middle Eastern nations, it is a state. For the United States, it does not consider it a state. In the UN, Palestine has kind of a pseudo statehood, which means at the UN, Palestine is able to show up, but they are only an observer. It does not have the right or ability to vote on issues in the General Assembly. Another unresolved issue is the city and status of Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was taken over in 1967 by Israel after the Six-Day War, so that is a hotly contested item. Think back to the first video. Jerusalem is an important city for three religions in particular: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Security barriers have been put up over the last who knows how many years because Israel has become more and more concerned with terrorist attacks. It's one thing for a country to put up a security barrier, but some of these security barriers are happening on Palestinian lands. There are still other issues. Palestinian refugees have existed since Israel's creation, but there are other Palestinian refugees that came to be because of other reasons, like the settlements and the expansion of settlements that have crept onto Palestinian lands, into homes where Palestinians have their homes knocked down because the Israeli government says they don't have building permits, and then they have their home demolished. Water resources are extremely important to anyone, and water resources are another issue here because in the West Bank, Israeli settlements have really good access to water resources, but Palestinians do not. Keep in mind, the key unresolved issue here is the settlements, the Israeli settlements that are in the West Bank. Keep in mind, the West Bank is Palestinian land, and this is where the Israeli settlements are located. Let's refocus our attention to a previous issue we addressed, security barriers. But this time, let's put it into context of the settlements. Security barriers are being put into place to protect Israeli citizens from attacks from suicide bombers. However, security barriers are being placed in the West Bank. Well, keep in mind, the West Bank is Palestinian land. It's as if I have a neighbor and I go into their yard, and then the neighbor tells me, "Get off my yard." And I go ahead and build a wall on their yard to protect myself from the neighbor. Let us now revisit the map of 1967 that we looked at last from the previous video and compare it to a map from 2010, which does have a lot of similarities and parallels to a map that you would see of 2020. In 1967, the Six-Day War occurred. Israel was victorious and occupied a lot of Palestinian land that has since been lost by Palestine, but introduced the occupation of Israel as well. The map in 2010 really goes to show the control Israel has over the entire West Bank specifically. Settlements are interspersed throughout the West Bank, and what you more or less see is the control of land that Israel has, even though the West Bank is supposedly Palestinian land. What you don't see on the map is how the land is chopped up in different ways that gives Israel so much control. For example, there are many settlements here, and a lot of those settlements have the high ground, which gives it an advantage, especially if there were to be some fighting that were to break out beyond the fighting that already occurs. The highway system has been put into place by Israel, which has given Israel a lot of control since those highway systems can be used by anybody, but they're really created to bypass Palestinian land and connect Israeli land. Additionally, what you don't see on this map as well are things such as the water resources that are available in the West Bank and how the settlements are positioned very nicely and strategically for Israelites in the West Bank to have access to that water. With Israel setting up settlements, occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and on top of that, the international community saying this is illegal, and yet Israel continues the same type of occupation it's had since 1967. How is one supposed to find peace in this situation? It's a huge challenge. And for the most part, it's been an up and down process. The main takeaway from this page is you have this back and forth between positive steps toward peace and negative steps back away from peace. But ultimately, throughout this entire process, more and more Israeli citizens are moving into the West Bank and into Jewish settlements. That will make the peace process only more challenging. While there is a continuous push for the United States to align itself with Israel, one has to keep in mind that there are consequences to that. And political Islam and its rise in the Middle East is one of those consequences. The relationship the United States has with Israel is not the only reason for a rise in political Islam in the East. Other reasons, such as Middle Eastern nations participating in capitalism, which has them participating in trade with the US, is an additional reason, and then there are others as well. Earlier I mentioned Israel wants to protect its citizens from suicide bombings. And who wouldn't? What country wouldn't want to protect their citizens from suicide bombers? Let's take a look at the cycle of suicide bombers and why they occur. If we consider suicide bombing the first action, then what's the reaction that occurs next? The next response is by the Israeli government, and it's usually a military response meant to crack down on Palestinian citizens in response to the suicide bombings. So, what's the next reaction? The next reaction is by the people of Palestine. They're the ones who have to face the Israeli response, the Israeli military response, due to the suicide bombing. That makes it easier to recruit suicide bombers, and we return to the beginning of this vicious cycle. However, how do we enter into the cycle in the first place? We mentioned in our terrorism unit that people don't just commit terrorist attacks for no reason at all. There's a reason. People do not commit suicide bombings for no reason. There is a reason. That reason in the West Bank, in Israel, is because of the military occupation that exists. That's how the cycle begins. In the next video, we'll revisit the United States and its relationship to oil in the Middle East. We'll see you next time.